The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
JFK 35 is a production of the JFK Library Foundation. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the JFK Library Foundation staff, board, or donors, or the JFK Library. The material and information presented here is for general historical and educational informational purposes only. The views expressed in the podcast are not meant to imply any endorsement of or opposition to any organization or political party.
The educated citizen has an obligation to serve the public. He may be a precinct worker or president. He may give his talents at the courthouse, the state house, the White House. He may be a civil servant or a senator, a candidate or a campaign worker, a winner or a loser. But he must be a participant and not a spectator.
Throughout President John F. Kennedy's life, he stressed that the success of the entire country is tied to its citizens who choose to enter public service at any level.
In this episode of Lessons on Democracy, we explore how his call to public service grew the ranks of public servants dramatically. Coming up next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter.
And I'm Jamie Richardson. Welcome to this special season of JFK 35, where we discuss lessons on democracy by looking back at President Kennedy's time in office. In this episode, we take a closer look at how JFK's commitment to building a government made up of skilled career public servants helped shape decades of national success. On Inauguration Day, he delivered a timeless challenge: ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That invitation to service inspired a generation and set a standard for public leadership that still echoes today.
Joining us to discuss why JFK believed the new frontier demanded a new kind of expert-driven public service is presidential historian and Kennedy biographer Fredrik Logevall. Fred is currently in the middle of writing a 3-volume biography on John F. Kennedy's life. He's also advising a new Netflix series based off of his research. Fred, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
Fred, this is our third episode on Lessons on Democracy, looking back at President Kennedy's administration and what he can teach us. In this episode, we want to look at his message of public service and how important that was for his administration and for our democratic country. And let's just start with the inaugural address, where he made that clarion call: ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That clear message that is up to the public to serve and be responsible partly for their own government. Where did that idea come from, and how did it get into the speech?
Well, I think it's something we see in John F. Kennedy's speech making really from the beginning. That is to say, when he ran for Congress in 1946, just back from the service, and really right through to the inaugural address, this extraordinary speech in January of 1961, and then indeed in later speeches right up to his death. So he extolled public service. It's a constant theme in these speeches. He challenged audiences, maybe especially on college campuses. I've just been writing about his campaign in 1960, and you see this in particular when he's at colleges, where he liked to give speeches, by the way. And he basically said, he challenged the students, as he challenged the American people in the address, the inaugural, really to give a portion of their lives to this shared American enterprise, as he put it. The other thing that's worth noting here is, of course, is that this is a message that came from his parents. So in a way, young Jack Kennedy imbibed this notion, this idea that you give something back, because he got that from his mother and his father, and in part also from his grandfather on his mother's side. But it's really there in all of his speeches, most of them.
And when they were writing that speech, do you think they expected the public to latch on to the idea the way that it did? Did they get sort of hints from previous speeches that this was going to be a very popular notion at the time?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably not fully. In other words, I think it surprised them the degree to which this just resonated with quite literally millions of young Americans, young people in particular. But it's also true that the most famous line in the speech, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, was one that he had used in different form in 3 or 4 of his speeches during the campaign. And so it was quite interesting to me when I was looking at these speeches in writing the second volume of the biography to see that, in fact, this was not a wholly new assertion, but it's one that he had used before. Still, I think I would say, Matt, that to a certain degree, they probably were surprised by how strongly, how deeply this resonated.
And how did President Kennedy use his campaign to set up his administration's goals of making public service as something to aspire to?
I think he, partly through repetition, I think the answer to that is that he, in his speeches, as we were saying, he hit upon this theme a lot. I think he made clear to audiences really across the country, if I'm successful in November, first, if I'm successful in winning the nomination of my party, and then if I'm successful in the campaign against the Republican nominee in the fall, you can expect that this is going to be something we, in my administration, stress. This is something we're going to hit upon. We are going to encourage maybe especially young people, because we should remember this is a young nation in 1960. Because of the baby boom, young Americans are really going to be at the forefront in so much of the politics of the 1960s. This is something that he sets up, it seems to me, continuously in his speech making, maybe in particular. In some of his publications, he wrote lots of articles. He and Ted Sorensen, they published a book, really a collection of speeches that comes out in 1960. You see this again and again.
And earlier in 1958, as a senator, he's in a speech said that the problems of the second half of the 20th century would take an assembly of talent in the civil service. What was it about these problems of the second half of the century where he thought a strong civil service would be so necessary?
Well, I think he believed that issues of public policy, both in terms of domestic affairs and also internationally, were steadily becoming more complex. So that in modern civilization, problems would need to be grappled with by a dedicated, talented civil service. He said in one speech, in fact, this question came up more or less in a few speeches. Can a nation organized and governed such as ours endure? Can it make it? And this was it was near the end of a speech, the one that I have in mind, in which he again stressed this is a complex world, and therefore we need a very talented and dedicated public service. Do we have what it takes, basically, to survive as a nation in this new world?
Were there issues in the first half of the century that JFK might have noticed where sort of less qualified or more politicized civil services made the nation more difficult? I kind of think of sometimes of those presidents who, just before Franklin Roosevelt, who really used patronage for their own personal gain. Were there examples like that President Kennedy kind of grew up noticing and maybe influenced how he saw that vision that you just mentioned?
I think no question. He was a savvy student of political history. He had a deeper, one of the themes in my work is that his understanding of history, his interest in history, was deeper than that of most politicians. So John F. Kennedy knew that political patronage, as you point out, was a constant in American politics, and to some extent it would continue, including in his own administration. So it's always an issue, and I think he understood this. But he also, I think, got that a lot of these people were not particularly qualified. They lacked the technical or other expertise that you would need in the modern world. And I think he worried about this. He worried that public service had begun to lose its luster among young people precisely when it was most needed. and that the success of government, as we were saying earlier, I think that he was convinced that the success of government depended on the quality of the career civil service. So yes, maybe there will be some patronage. Maybe that's part of our system, and it's okay at the top level. But we need a really capable civil service underneath.
So, what are some of the examples for JFK's administration that he acted on to try to build this better and larger, more capable civil service that would back up the political appointees?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's one that I'm still researching as I work on the final part of my study, my work. It's clear that he wanted to improve the federal civil service through various initiatives. He wanted to promote, for example, employee management relations through some of these efforts, civil rights, and believed that you needed a really good civil service to implement the legislation that his administration was wanting to promote, carry out government functions. So, for example, one particular executive order gave federal workers the right to organize. We may take that sort of for granted today, but it wasn't then. There was also a commission, the Civil Service Commission, which played an important role in administering the civil service, the federal civil service system, giving, for example, employees the right to appeal adverse personnel actions. Again, something we take perhaps for granted, but wasn't then. There was also federal salary reform. In other words, you got to pay people. This was something that the administration felt strongly about. And finally, an example that comes to mind based on the work I've done thus far is something called the President's Commission on the Status of Women, which was put forth, which was established. And I think what sort of underscores all these efforts was Kennedy's belief that you need loyalty, you need responsibility, you need energy and competence among your federal employees.
And why do democracies depend so much on well-qualified and also non-political civil servants?
Well, it's a complex world, and it's becoming more so. So I think this is actually a more pressing need today than it was even in Kennedy's time. And it's very hard, if not impossible, for that complex system to function if every time there's a new administration and a new party takes power in terms of the White House, the whole civil service below also changes. That can't work, it seems to me, and certainly Kennedy's belief was that the career civil service, those people at the middle level, and I suppose the lower level, needed to remain, at least in substantial numbers, because of the expertise that only develops over time, that you can't get if you come in, and 3 months later you're in charge of this, that, or the other thing. It's just going to be very hard to do. Perhaps at the top, we can have political appointments, but I think democracies, to come back to your question, in order for democracies in a complicated modern world to function, you need to have the non-political civil servants. You need to have those who are there for a career and are kind of a constant in the system.
And to kind of get back to another one of JFK's public service endeavors was to get young people involved to go and share their time and knowledge in other countries, what would be called the Peace Corps. Also, older people as well went over. How did that organization meet his ideal of public service?
Well, I mean, it's of a piece. I think it is public service writ large, I guess we could say. This time, as you say, involving work overseas. But the impulse, it seems to me, is the same. We should also note that with respect to the Peace Corps, there is a geopolitical motivation. It's not merely, a desire to do good, but there's also a Cold War, a more ruthless, is that the right word for this? A geopolitical ambition here, which is we are in a battle against the Soviet Union for the support of people around the world, including in the developing world. And the Peace Corps is a way for us to win that support. It's an example of what later becomes known as soft power. In this case, an opportunity for the United States through the Peace Corps to bring people in the developing world to its side rather than to the side of the communists. And so he floats this idea initially, and it did not begin here. There were ideas of this kind percolating both in Congress and outside Congress for months. But in a speech late at night at the University of Michigan, a few weeks before the election, he floats this idea, and the students are, rapturous in response. He then develops it further in a speech in San Francisco a couple of weeks later, very close to the election. And I think it became clear to Kennedy then, if not before, that this is something that people would respond to, that is to say, the Peace Corps. And then, of course, it comes into being early in his administration.
And, with this new emphasis on public service and having this well-trained civil service, as the backstop for every administration to make sure things get carried over, you needed to train these people. You needed to have people graduating with degrees. And so JFK seemed to value the university systems as partners in training. How did JFK look at universities and how the government could work with these systems that are in place across the country to train the public servants of tomorrow?
Yeah, he believed it was of vital importance. That is to say, he was a big believer in higher education, big believer in America's universities. I think that his own education, his Harvard education mattered a great deal to him, and his ties to the university, really to the end of his days, were hugely important to John F. Kennedy. But more broadly, I think he grasped how important universities were to America's rise, first to great power status and now to superpower status. How important universities were to America's wealth, to its prestige. And again, because society was becoming more complex, the training and education that universities provided, including to engineers and scientists, but also those who are in the humanities, social sciences, were just going to be more important than ever before. And again, as I said earlier, he would often say to university audiences when he was on the campaign trail, he would urge them, the students, commit yourself, at least for a short time, to this great country of ours. And it was a kind of challenge and exhortation to which many of them responded.
And for our final question on public service, we talked about how important civil servants are to democracy. How important is it in a democracy for the nation to buy into this idea of public service that Kennedy had versus if a democracy exists but most of the public are dismayed in public servants or even more turned off from the government and working for the government? Like, what is the difference between a democracy that has, a vibrant public service and people who are inspired to go and give their time versus maybe a democracy where the public have grown dissatisfied with government and are maybe turned off from this idea of public service?
I think it matters enormously how people respond to public service. Kennedy believed, I think, in the notion of a shared enterprise, that Americans were in this together, that the country ultimately would rise or fall on the degree to which ordinary Americans across the country would commit themselves to serving the country in one form or another, or at least back forcefully what public servants were doing on their behalf, and ideally themselves contribute to that cause. If you don't have that, if you succumb to cynicism or to a kind of extreme individualism in which you don't commit to doing something on behalf of others, looking beyond yourselves. This is again what Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy preached to their kids when they were little. We expect you to look beyond yourself. You are extremely blessed because your father has, earned so much money for the family. You need to look beyond yourselves. And I think that's what Kennedy took, and he was now giving that message to Americans, as were others. I don't mean to suggest that JFK was alone in this. I think it's emblematic, it's characteristic of this generation of politicians that many of them extolled public service. But it's absolutely vital, I guess is my point, and that if you don't have it, and I think there are reasons to be concerned about our current moment in this regard, then democracy is going to be much harder to sustain.
Well, thank you, Fred. Thank you for the insights. And looking back at, President Kennedy's life, where his emphasis on public service started young. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to our third episode of Lessons on Democracy by JFK 35. If you're interested in learning more about some of the material we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or find us on social at JFKLibraryFDN using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.